It's possible that on my weekly run through this neighborhood of South St. Vital, that includes St. Mary's Road, ends up connecting with Aldgate, back up to St. Anne's, to Nova Vista, and finally home, that it's possible somewhere on freshly laid cement are the words written into this drying cement, "Love yourself." And it's possible, perhaps, that further on my run through our neighborhood each day, there are two hearts etched into freshly poured concrete. And it's also possible that even further on in this concrete are the words, "Love your neighbor." It's possible. It's probable. But regardless of whether or not of some or all of these words are somewhere in this neighborhood, it's quite exciting to imagine that this subversive message continues to be talked about. Jesus who? Our scriptures describe who Jesus is in some of the following ways: as Emmanuel, as Mother Hen, as Jesus the highest, as the Word of God, the wisdom of God, a prophet, rabbi, and even describes Jesus as the lily of the valley. Asking Jesus who he is a very dangerous question. For some of you, you may know that we as a congregation have begun a 12-week session throughout the course of 2011-2012 called Saving Jesus. The intent behind this program is to reclaim a Jesus that we see in the media that is used as a weapon, that is used as a judge, and to say that Jesus is central to who we are as a Christian community. And it's possible that we've stopped asking who Jesus is because of what we see in the media. And here's why this is important. As this one commentator says, it's all very interesting, if sometimes confusing, and it matters. As N.T. Wright pointed out, quote, "What you say about Jesus affects your entire worldview. If you see Jesus differently, everything changes." Jesus' questions, "Who do you say that I am?" is an invitation to take personally and seriously the possibility that maybe we need to see him differently. So who? Who do we say that Jesus is? This is a dangerous question. And when we stop asking the question, we stand in temptation of creating a fluffy Jesus. A Jesus that sort of looks like Barney, bouncing around, wanting to hug everybody, love everybody, make you feel good, but doesn't push you. We stand in the danger of seeing Jesus as our friend, which he is, but he's more than that. We stand in danger of trivializing who Jesus is and what he might be saying to us and simply becoming a community club or a social organization that becomes exclusive and turns people away. It's a dangerous question. And it's one that is as old as our faith community. It stretches back 2,000 years. And so it sort of feels appropriate to go back to that Matthew community that's asking the question, to understand their context, who they are, and what they might have to say to us, or perhaps remind us of what we've heard before. So, the Jesus community is writing a generation or two after the death of Jesus. There's a living memory of his ministry, but they're finding that they're in synagogue, and they're not getting along so well with their cousins and their brothers and sisters because they happen to believe this other Jew, named Jesus, was the Messiah. And a majority of those in synagogue don't believe them. And one of the reasons they don't believe them is that the larger world, called the Roman Empire, is not playing very nice with the state of Judea. And so there are tensions. People are trying to find a balance about how to live together, and things are starting to fray. And something else is happening. When Jesus was around and called himself the Messiah, It wasn't a supernatural term. It didn't indicate something above or beyond. It was, oh, you're Jesus. You're connected with the line of David. You must have something important to say. It wasn't yet a title. He wasn't Jesus the Christ. And so, in the scripture that we read today, Jesus asked the question, who do you say that I am? And this question is central to any community that calls itself Christian today, in the future, and in the past. But Jesus does something which I find interesting, and sort of where I went with this reflection. He actually says who he is. He says he's the Son of Man. It's not really very helpful 2,000 years later, so let's dig a little deeper. The Son of Man. The Son of Man is at best, an ambiguous term. It's a term that can be found throughout the Semitic languages that are contemporary with our Old Testament, and it generally means human being. There might be a sense of a full human being, but what that means isn't really clear. We have two sources in our ancient sources of the Hebrew Scriptures that refer to Jesus in this way, that Jesus is referring back to these stories from the prophetic tradition. And one comes from the book of Daniel, and Daniel describes the Son of Man in sort of a traditional apocalyptic, basically, someone's going to come with a really big sword and fix everything. But there's another part, and it comes from the book of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel uses the Son of Man in a sense of humility, that whoever or whatever this Son of Man is that will come will do so in a humble and dangerous way. It's important to remember that in our scriptures, Jesus actually refers to himself as the Son of Man. And more importantly, it's not just the community putting that in his mouth. It is generally accepted that Jesus' ministry, he actually calls himself the Son of Man. And as people who ask a lot of questions, so what? The people who are hearing Jesus' message in the Matthew community are expecting someone to come with a really big sword and fix it all. They're expecting Daniel's Son of Man, the apocalyptic prophet. And yet, what we know ends up happening is that he becomes this subversive prophet and more than that. So Ezekiel, that humble and dangerous part, is a recipe for subversion about what everybody thinks they're going to get may not be very well what they get. What we do know is that Jesus doesn't talk about himself a lot, but what he does talk about, some might say incessantly, is the kingdom of heaven. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. For the Matthew community, the remembrance of Jesus' ministry among them is not something in the future. It's not something that might happen. It's not something that we're all going to heaven one day. It starts now. The loose of the earth, the soil outside this church that was tilled last week, that was turned as we did our care for this property as farmers to the south of us, what we do now brings about the kingdom of heaven. And that's what the Matthew community was being told. Who do you say that I am? Which brings us back to the fluffy Jesus danger. If we stop asking who Jesus is to us today, it's very easy to forget that Jesus' ministry, in most cases, if we're going to parallel, wasn't to us. Jesus didn't and wasn't born into this faith community. Jesus preached and walked among those in Palestine who were on the periphery. He walked with those who were discarded and marginalized, who had no value, who were valueless. And if we need to imagine what some of those parallels might look like, when Jesus talks about the children, in the Roman Empire, children could be discarded on garbage heaps. A parallel today might be a young man who's questioning his sexual orientation and lives in a culture that says if you're gay, you're valueless, that might use Jesus to say Jesus hates you, and that young man might end up taking his own life, as occurred in Ottawa last week. Jesus came to him and said, "You're loved." If we want another parallel, imagine an Aboriginal youth watching television. And what he sees on that screen is a culture that says, we need more money for our crime bill agenda to put this statistic back in jail. Because he's only going to come into our lives, rob our houses, rape our children, and kill us. Jesus comes into his midst and says, you're loved and you're valuable. If we need one more example, think about the person who's begging. Think about the slaves. And now think about the Filipino worker who's working right now in this city and every single city in North America and is invisible and is part of a slave trade that makes slavery that happened 150 years ago look like a soccer game in a park in South St. Vital. These are the people to whom Jesus comes. And if we forget that Jesus' ministry was among these people and think it was among us, we've created a fluffy Jesus. And the love that Jesus talks about, the love that brings about the kingdom of heaven, in the New Testament is called agape. And in the New Testament, there are three kinds of love. There's agape, phileo, and eros. The love that Jesus is talking about isn't that fluffy Barney love. It's a love that's passionless, and it's not passive. It is action-oriented. So whereas filial love is brotherly love, is passionless, that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's also not talking about eros, which is passion, desire. The things that when we meet that special person in our life and we all feel happy and excited, that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about to this community who has nothing, these people who are marginalized and believe they have no value, is agape. And that kind of love in the Greek is action-oriented and is probably better understood as loving kindness. Acts of loving kindness that you do for another person. So when we read about Jesus coming amongst the people, we need to remember that he's doing this most often in a rural context, and he's getting these people to throw a party every single time he walks into their midst. These people who have nothing, who are taught to hoard, to keep their own wealth, whatever that small amount might be, to share it with each other. And when they do that, when they perform these acts of loving kindness, they start to be subversive. They start to cause trouble. People don't get executed for being fluffy. Jesus was executed. People expected a warrior. They expected this apocalyptic Son of Man to come and fix everything. But maybe just as importantly, the people who were listening to Jesus' message saw him gathering 5,000 people at a time, and that scared them. It scared them because he might actually be that revolutionary. He might actually be telling these people to pick up swords and march against them. And it's also possible that there were those people who knew that what Jesus' real danger was that he was addressing the economic inequities, the realities that created the poor and the marginalized and those who weren't healthy, and he was offering them an alternative to what society said, which was hoard your wealth, keep your wealth. And through all of this, as he was questioned by Pharisees in our scriptures, as he was doubted, he stood firm to the simple formula, his ultimate commandment, that how we love one another is the gauge about how we live into the kingdom of heaven. And that kingdom of heaven begins now. People expected a fighter, and what they got was anything but. It's great to ask questions. Doesn't necessarily give us clarity. So where does that leave us? Who do we say that Jesus is? Who do we say that Jesus is for us in the 21st century? And this is the same tension that this question arises and continues to create 2,000 years later. People want a warrior. We want, when we're hurt, to respond by you're either for us or you're against us. And Jesus' response is how we love one another, how we love our neighbor, how we love our enemies, is the gauge to the extent to which we're living into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus knew himself as the Son of Man. Jesus' ministry in the Matthew community as the Son of Man was among the least. Jesus' ministry was not what the world expected, and he modeled a ministry of subversion through loving kindness, through a radical sharing that made everybody very, very uncomfortable. And as those who say we are Christians, as those who have heard his message and realize that the people he was with, standing with today, likely is not in this congregation, but are perhaps in the sweatshops in India, are in the reserves of northern Canada, are in the towns of Guatemala, Jesus is looking back and saying to us, if you name yourselves as Christians, if you are following me as the Son of Man, who do you say that I am? And I would offer, this is the fun thing about asking questions, this is a question we've already answered. We answered this question about 100 years ago, and our denomination called it the social gospel. Right now, there is a global protest occurring that is the fastest growing protest in human history called Occupy Wall Street. It's occurring in every major Western city, and it's a secular response that addresses economic inequities. And that is what the social gospel did over 100 years ago. It said and challenged the systems that create oppression and suffering and illness, that if these systems are creating the poor, you need to ask yourself some questions. Now, people might say, well, now you're getting political. The fact is, we've always been a political people. We just haven't always been the people with the power, but we've been the people with influence. And so we are asked to do two things. One is to ask the questions. This system called communism, capitalism, Marxism, mercantilism, whatever the system is where you exchange goods in order to be fed, is it creating the kingdom of heaven? And we can't be responsible for changing the system, but we can ask the questions. And more importantly, we are actually asked in our faith communities to actually live this out now. So this isn't new. The social gospel came out of a context of the Depression, found its sails billowing behind the winds of a depression that saw wealth concentrated in the hands of few. And in the 21st century, that disparity of wealth is even more dramatic. And so people are asking questions about economic systems, which means, how do we spend money? How do we share wealth? The social gospel would say, ask us to ask questions about the system of economics that we currently live in. And right now, we are living in a system of economics called consumerism, which, ironically, is born out of a system called capitalism, which was actually written by a Christian named Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, I'm going to gloss over, basically was saying we all have a right to live life. And we all have a right to a decent living. And so does my neighbor. And so does my other neighbor. Consumerism, however, is grounded in a faulty premise that leads to a fallacious conclusion. And that premise is that we live in a world with unlimited resources. And therefore, the conclusion is that I can live in a place of unlimited profit. That profit will always grow and resources will always be there to make my product. The fact is that the earth can't do that, and we know that. For those of you who has farmers in your family who perhaps were working soil in your community garden, you know that the soil, that the planet can only sustain a certain amount. And so this leads to an economic system that desecrates the earth. People then become a commodity in this system of consumerism. People in Guatemala, in India, in China, in the hidden sweatshops in this city alone become merely another resource to create more products. And so life becomes valueless. Unless you actually are benefiting from the system, it's really easy to just see them as they don't work hard enough. If they just got off their butt and worked, they'd make money. But that system can't sustain itself based on those premises. And the other piece about our economic system that we need to ask questions, and we all live in this tension that we benefit from it, is that it leads to militarization. We are currently, as a country, living in a war footing that we have not seen since World War II. We are fighting more wars as a country called Canada than we've ever fought in before. This week alone, we announced $35 billion to build new warships. $35 billion. I don't mean to be flip, but has anybody been up to what we call the reserve system? Has anybody been into the North End to say, who's benefiting from the system? I think these are questions we have to ask ourselves. Life becomes devalued when we have to protect a system that is built on faulty legs. And we need to remember our social gospel. We need to continue to say that who do we say that Jesus is has been answered by those who come before us in this denomination. Those who came together to create the United Church of Canada. We need to remember that we were involved intimately in the creation of a universal healthcare system that says human life, that our current economic system in many ways devalues, is a right. You shouldn't have to bankrupt your family to fix your broken leg, need alone if you have other ailments, whether they're hidden, such as mental illness, or whether they're clearly on your body. You shouldn't have to bankrupt your family to be cared and loved. We were part of that. We are part of that system. The other thing that the social gospel teaches us, Matthew's questions as a community, who do we say that Jesus is that humbling part. We make mistakes, and we've made mistakes, and we'll keep making mistakes. One of those mistakes was our involvement in the residential school system. And we're acknowledging those mistakes. It's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight. It requires us recognizing that there are 2 or 3 generations of Indigenous people in this country who have been ripped away from their family, from their culture. And we need to be present with them as they discover who they are. We need to recognize, we need to celebrate that in this building alone yesterday, the United Church of Canada held a consultation that looks at the state of where we are in respect to our relationship with gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and two-spirited people. We need to remember that this work of inclusivity has nothing to do with somebody's sexual orientation. It has everything to do that goes back to the founding of our denomination that began to ask questions about the rights of women. Can a woman be a minister? Can a woman be a minister? Yes. Apparently so, since my partner, who's not here and leaving me with you alone, isn't here right now. But there are other Christian denominations that don't value that gender, that say you can worship in this community, but you can't be a leader because of your gender. The United Church began asking these questions, and that has led to where we are now, looking at people's orientation. The fact is, in 20 years, I highly suspect that we'll be talking about something else that probably makes other people upset. If you look at the literature about people who are upset about what we've said about gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and two-spirited people, it's the same words, the same anger that was directed at our church when we were talking about women being ordained ministers, when we were talking about women having the right to vote. It's the same hatred. And we need to recognize and celebrate that. So what is the good news? Where do we find the good news? This is the exciting part. It's a choice. It's a choice of recognizing where we've been, who we've said Jesus is, and more importantly, do we continue doing that work? The kingdom of heaven literally begins with loving kindness we offer as Jesus' disciples in the world right now.